Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, the U.S. threatens to remove Chinese companies from Wall Street and will limit travel visas for CPC members and their families to 1 month. Are new tensions about to heat up? Australia Prime Minister Scott Morrison seeks conciliation in the CG art dispute with China. Is the diplomatic war of words starting to cool down? And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Hello, welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Pan Deng in Beijing. This past week has seen an industrial load of anti-China measures pushed forward by the United States. The Trump administration has banned cotton imports from Xinjiang, limited visa access for members of the Communist Party of China, blacklisted 4 more Chinese companies as so-called military-controlled, and passed a bill aimed at removing foreign companies, especially Chinese ones, from U.S. stock exchanges for not complying with auditing information. So what's behind these intensive moves? What other actions will Trump take against China during his final weeks in office? And what difference will a Biden presidency make to China-U.S. relations? To talk more about those, we are joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics in our Beijing studio, and via Skype we have Mr. Jonathan Pollack, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution in Los Angeles. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. So let's start with this U.S. Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Mr. Pollack, is this one specially tailored for China?
It would seem so. I think it's very important to note here that we are at a very fraught moment in American politics. We are in a presidential transition from Mr. Trump to Mr. Biden. There is deep polarization, and until even the last few days, there hasn't been much cooperation between the outgoing Trump administration and the incoming Biden administration. So all of these are factors here, and in this context, the Trump administration continues to emphasize its desire to impede, disrupt, and complicate the U.S.-China relationship in all ways possible before it leaves office. He will leave office in another 6.5 weeks. So what they are attempting to do is to make it as difficult as possible for President-elect Biden to move back towards, if we will, a more normal relationship with China when he enters office on January 20th. But I must emphasize, these kinds of actions that are taken can also be undone. I don't have any direct knowledge of what the deliberations might be in the transition team, but I think many of these individuals undoubtedly recognize that these are factors, right? These recent actions are intended to make life as difficult as possible between the governments of the U.S. and China, but also the kinds of economic and commercial relationships that exist. And having been taken abruptly and unilaterally, it does not follow that they will be maintained indefinitely. A lot of it would depend on the way these regulations have been drafted, but these are actions for the Trump administration, if you will, on the way out the door, not the actions of the Biden administration entering the door. We will know soon enough what Mr. Biden's priorities are, but I personally suspect that he does not view these actions as the kinds of table-setting actions that he would wish to begin his administration with, and he will have to deal with when he enters power in January.
Do you think Chinese companies, businesses should be worried about this? And what about the hurt this may cause on U.S. businesses? Because let's remember, U.S. venture capitals also invested heavily into some of China's internet giants.
I think what this act really says is a little bit different from other actions taken by the Trump administration. I mean, this act is mostly coming from the Congress. I mean, the Senate bill was actually passed already in May this year, and it was led by Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. And you know, a few days ago, they had an oral vote in the House. But what this bill says is that it sets a 3-year window such that the Chinese authority And this organization we talk about, it's called Public Companies Auditing Oversight Board, will have to be engaged in a negotiation to work out some rules such that companies auditing these public listed companies in the United States from China will have to follow the same set of auditing rules as being done under the auspices of PCAOB. China's
now,
stance
having said that, is this in a bit to choke capital flows between the two countries?
Well, I think it's still going to take some time for this bill to work out. I think, what's the issue here is that China's government's position is that it involves data release that concerns China's national security. So this bill actually allows for the two sides to come up with some common rules that both sides can agree upon. So I won't rush immediately to the judgment that it's going to have immediately see companies delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, for example. But I think it's more of a sort of a psychological impact. Chinese companies will be more cautious about going to the United States to be publicly listed. And you're absolutely right that a lot of those companies have investors from America. The total, I have read a report that says that the total value of these companies, about 200-some companies listed in the United States, ever since they've been listed, the total value as of today, as of right now, is actually 10 times as the initial value when they went public. That means that many Americans investors have really benefited from these public listing companies. So I think it's not just a one-way street. It's fundamentally a two-way street. And that American investors also stand to benefit a lot from this phenomenon. At the end of the day, it's here in China that are creating a lot of these IPOs, and that American investors want to take a share of that.
So what about the blacklisting of 4 more Chinese companies, including China's largest chip makers, SMIC, and national offshore oil and gas producer, CNOOC? Do you think this is purely about technological containment, or there's an underlying political agenda? Because let's face it, all those entities on that blacklist of the United States are mainly Chinese state-owned enterprises.
This action is very different. This is coming from the Commerce Department. It's coming from the State Department. These are the organizations currently. They want to box in the Sino-U.S. relationship on a track that they would like to see. And I think clearly these are the actions, the last-minute actions for a lame duck president trying to hand on power. And I would totally agree with your previous guest that these things are reversible. These things probably will see changes as the Biden administration comes in. Clearly, it's the last-ditch effort trying to sabotage and continue to sabotage the Sino-U.S. relationship.
Talking about sabotage, let's talk about a move that will have possible massive effects. Mr. Pollack, what about the new U.S. visa restrictions on all communist members, all members of the CPC and their families? Xinhua calls it a resurgence of McCarthyism. Do you think so?
Well, it's actually somewhat different from McCarthyism, but it has the same kind of an impulse. It just boggles the mind and the imagination to argue that anyone who is a member of the Chinese Communist Party or their families will now face this kind of scrutiny and limitations on what they can do. If this is the intent of the Trump administration. The Trump administration is on its way out the door. I would argue that this is an area where a lot of the damage can be addressed, can be ameliorated if there is an early will in the Biden administration to do so. It doesn't mean it will happen overnight, but there's a clear recognition that this just goes beyond the realities of what how China functions as an economy, how it functions as a political system. It really is this part of this effort to separate the economies, to decouple them in any way possible, and to inflict maximum damage on the bilateral relationship.
Now, talking about damage, Mr. Pollack, you said many can be reversed in a possible Biden presidency, but when the damage is too deep, do you think it can be totally reversed?
Well, I think, look, among other things, foreign policy is not an on-off switch, even if that is the way the Trump administration is trying to deal with it, to make all these declarations and then assume that everything changes. So there is no question but that on issues like the visa question, on issues of the tariffs and so forth, it will not be changed overnight. It will take serious discussion between the relevant authorities on both sides to repair it, but that will take time. And to be frank, Mr. Biden enters office with problems not only in relation to China, but a host of domestic issues that he will need to focus on, concentrate on very, very much. What he will try to do, I believe, is to preserve those areas where there is such a self-evident need for cooperation between the United States and China, to reactivate some of those channels that have been shut down over the last few years, this year in particular, and to see whether or not some kind of accommodation can be reached with China that will benefit both countries and the peoples of both countries. These are really the tests. What we're dealing with here in terms of the actions of the Trump administration, it's kind of like a giant wrecking ball, inflicting as much damage as possible. But, you know, I think that with intelligent consideration, careful planning, serious discussions between governments, many of the damages, much of the damage can be eased, but it's not going to be an overnight thing. This is going to be a challenge that the Biden administration will face, and that the Chinese Communist Party will face.
I want to add a note to this issue, actually. You know, the idea that the United States government doesn't want to deal with anybody from the Communist Party in itself is very questionable, but it's actually quite strange and also quite alarming and shocking to me that this issue would also extend to family members of a Communist Party. This is everything American, right? I mean, you have people here in the United States that they have different political views, right? And how would you extend a political issue to a family member? And this is shocking to me. This is, you know, I think it's clearly a violation of the First Amendment rights. It is very American. This is not the core American value that the Trump administration is supposed to reflect. And it sets a very bad example internationally. I think President-elect Biden has been talking about the damages that the Trump administration has done to the American diplomatic values and democracy values, and this is just one more example that the Trump administration has done to undermine American democracy, American freedom values.
A diplomatic war of words between Australia and China over a graphic tweet seemed to finally cool as Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison struck a much more conciliatory tone, saying he and his government are seeking happy coexistence with China. So what accounts for his sudden change of attitude, with bilateral ties hitting a new low? What are the underlying reasons behind the tensions, and what can both sides do to repair relations? With these questions in mind, we're joined by Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University, Mr. Daryl Guppy, founder and director of guppytraders.com in Darwin, and Professor John Gong again in our Beijing studio. So, gentlemen, let's start with the roller coaster change of attitude from Prime Minister Scott Morrison in a single week. From that furious rant against what he called a fake photo, which is actually a CG art, to happy coexistence. Mr. Guppy, what do you make of this drama?
It certainly is a roller coaster ride, and Prime Minister Morrison tried to reset it, but then he was sort of derailed and sidetracked by this tweet and, as you point out, this CGI cartoon, and he certainly overreacted to that. Part of the reason I suspect this is that he was addressing a domestic audience, because it seems that his skills in dealing in international audiences are not so good.
What's your take on this, Professor Chen Hong? Do you think this is a political stunt or a mistake?
I think that definitely this was not a mistake. That was a deliberate political stunt, because actually, as we can see, that actually, you know, Mr. Morrison was very quick in seizing this opportunity to his own advantage. He was actually facing enormous pressures from domestic, public opinion and also the international community, pointing, accusing fingers at Australia, especially, at the Australian troops' atrocities, in Afghanistan. So there was really public outrage and outcry. For Mr. Morrison, he was really making, this kind of, their tweet, which was actually, definitely, it was a computer graphic, but he was actually misleading the public in accusing it of being a faked photo. We know that actually internationally we have got very negative feelings about fake news. So he was really taking advantage of this very strong antipathy towards fake news, to misleading the public to think that this was a deliberate act of disinformation on the part of the Chinese government. And he was using such very strong words such as repugnant, calling the Chinese government of being shameful. Those, in other words, are definitely not out of mistake. That was a deliberate stance.
And there is always a price to pay, maybe sometimes heavy price to pay, for a political stunt like this. Mr. Guppy, do you think Australia is ready for that, to pay that price?
I think Australia is beginning to understand the size of that price that may be paid.
How about, talking about size, how about this? According to Bloomberg, Australia is the world's most China-dependent developed economy. How about that?
That's certainly true, and Australia's prosperity depends upon good relations with China. And yet, for some time, we've had a government that seems to not understand that relationship and has been pursuing just one side, the security aspects. So the Australian public is beginning to understand that, in fact, there is some very serious consequences of this immature discussion that's taking place. The Australian business community is particularly concerned and has been working for some time to try and improve relations, to encourage the Prime Minister to tone down the discussion, to hand the discussion perhaps across to a special envoy so that people can meet and discuss and talk about this in a rational and sensible way. And we're certainly hoping the Chinese businesses are doing the same on the China side.
Now, you're a trade insider, Mr. Guppy. Have you felt any impacts, negative impacts maybe, from Australia's recent moves against China since the beginning of the pandemic on Hong Kong, and now also so many unhappy incidents happened on diplomacy? Have you felt any impact?
Yes, the impact is very significant. Perhaps not just for myself, but for other people, because what it has done, it has undermined relationships that have been built up over 5 or 10 or 15 years. My friends in China say, what are you doing? What is happening? What is Australia doing? And I have to be able to explain to them, look, what is happening in domestic politics should not be transferred to international politics. We are working as hard as we can to get government to understand that this is not the way to enhance relationships with China. We need to look at how Japan handles the same sorts of discussions. They have a much more sophisticated approach, and there's a lot that we could learn.
Professor Chen Hong, let me refer you to former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's recent advice on dealing with China to Canberra. He said Australia should learn from Japan and, quote, put away the megaphone. What does that mean exactly, Professor?
Yes, I think actually Mr. Rudd was actually quite judicious in pointing out that actually there is a kind of pragmatism that statesmen, politicians need to adopt when facing with handling international affairs. You have to be pragmatic. You don't have to be such a kind of loudspeaker all the time, or throughout the time. You have to be depending on diplomacy, rather than always making accusatory remarks and always pointing fingers at the other side. That was definitely not a mature statesman should be behaving. Australia, in recent years, have been heavily dependent on such kind of so-called megaphone diplomacy. Well, this is definitely not diplomacy. That's definitely undiplomatic. But on the other hand, of course, megaphone, this kind of way is actually very apparent in the way that actually Australian politicians, the Morrison government, have been doing, always trying to make such kind of accusations all the time, and that was definitely causing enormous damage to the bilateral relations.
And Professor Gong, what about the impacts on people-to-people exchanges between the two countries? Because Australia was one of the most popular destinations for Chinese students study overseas. Do you think that picture will get a little bit gloomy in the near future?
I think it's already taking an impact. I think many Chinese students are reconsidering the prospect of going to Australia to do graduate studies and undergraduate studies. Now, I want to get back to this first question about what's his intention of doing this. It's a little bit hard for me to believe this could be a political stunt because essentially he is, if he knows this is not a piece of art, it's not a fake photo, it's not concocted, then he would be making fool of himself in front of entire Australian people and in the international community as well. And now he has to go back and admit that he made a huge mistake. So, it's a little bit difficult for me to fathom the prospect that he would do this deliberately to use a very serious bilateral international relationship for domestic political use.
But another argument is that even if he knows that is a CG art, he has to say that maybe that's a fake picture, because if it's art, then it's part of freedom of expression.
Well, I think he made a mistake. If he had known this and he deliberately do this, pretending that he thinks this is a fake photo, I think by this time he knows that he has to admit his mistake, and it's basically making fool of himself. It's hard for me to believe that, because if you want to make this thing a sensational issue for the Australian people, you have to stick to this, right? Now he has to take it back his position and change his story. So I think it reflects his total incompetence on this issue. And of course, I understand there's a background leading to this. Australia played a quite leadership role in terms of accusing China.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that very soon. So people-to-people exchanges.
Yeah, I think it's going to have an impact. I think people-to-people exchanges are fundamental associated with business exchanges. And if the business is going down, I think people-to-people exchanges will also be impacted as well.
Right, Mr. Guppy, do you have a contingency plan for that impact you just mentioned? And do you think the recently signed RCEP, the world's largest free trade deal, may bring a little bit light at the end of that tunnel?
It's certainly hoped that RCEP will bring light to the end of the tunnel. We've had a senior economist, Tim Harcourt, say this gets Australia and China around the table. So what's important is that we need to take advantage of that opportunity, put the leaders to one side, take the Prime Minister out of the discussion, leave the discussion to diplomats, to people who have experience with China, who understand what is happening. Because there is a lot of what you might call cultural insensitivity here. Now, we need to remember that Prime Minister Morrison at one stage was Minister for Tourism, and he ran an infamous tourism campaign called Where the Bloody Hell Are You?, which succeeded in offending about 90% of the population on a worldwide basis. So his understanding of cultural sensitivity is not particularly good, and that's partly on display in the moment in the China relationship. In terms of our contingency planning, organisations like the Australia-China's Business Council, of which I am a member, are working very hard to work with ministers and the Prime Minister and others to have them to understand that the approach that will work is to tone down the rhetoric. If you want to play to a domestic market, which is what he wants to do and does very successfully, then remember there are significant impacts on the international relations as well. You must be much, much more careful and much, much more respectful in the discussions.
So you're saying that this is the consensus, at least from Australia's business circle?
This is very much the consensus in the Australian business circle, and it is becoming stronger. Initially, when people looked at the arguments that were going on, they thought, yes, this happens from time to time, it will pass over. But as it's gone on and become worse and worse, people have become much, much more concerned about the long-term impacts, the destruction of friendships, the destruction of business relationships that have been built up, in some cases, over decades.
Well, gentlemen, now it's time to take a look at this week's Newsmaker.
My position and my government's position is to seek constructive engagement. The relationship with China is a mutually beneficial one.
So, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, it is. Mr. Guppy, a trending topic recently in your country on Twitter is hashtag ScoMo's gotta go. So why he is getting much more unpopular in recent days in Australia?
We must remember that the Prime Minister is a very successful domestic politician. He does not have the same skill in international relations, which is quite obvious from what is happening. So domestically, he's been able to play the Brereton report very well. So when we have China sending tweets around the CGI cartoon, he's able to use that as a domestic way to distract from scrutiny on that particular issue within Australia. So please, he is a very, very skilled domestic politician within Australia. So those particular tweets, ScoMo's got to go. We have all sorts of tweets like that.
Sorry, are you saying that he's a very skilled politician in your country? But what about his vacation during the bushfire raging on?
COVID trumps everything. Yes, he had significant problems in being in Hawaii during the bushfire crisis. However, his handling of the COVID crisis has given him tremendous prestige within the Australian environment. And we've seen that with a number of state elections where the key campaign has been around keeping you safe from COVID. So he's been very skilled at using that.
Well, Professor Chen Hong, give us a damage estimate on Scott Morrison has caused on China-Australia relations.
Well, he has been wreaking havoc to the bilateral relations throughout the years that he had been in power. He had been, the one who announced the total ban, the blanket ban on Huawei. He was the first in the world to start this kind of so-called independent inquiry on the origin and also spread of the coronavirus. The inquiry was obviously, against China. Throughout his, his prime ministership, he had been, talking. Sometimes conciliatory way, but on the other hand, he had been wreaking very concrete damage, to the bilateral relations. I think actually actions speak louder than words. So, in spite of the fact that he had been making some kind of sweet talks in the recent days, about the bilateral relations, we need to see more concrete and substantial actions and measures and policies he would like to put into action.
Professor Gong, do you think there will be a long road for the two countries' economic and trade ties to come back to normalcy? And do you think this divide between security by America and economy and trade with China will work? How long will that go for?
I'm a little bit concerned that the damage to the business relationship between the countries is going to be permanent. There's a reason behind this, because I think this has to do with China's trade with the United States. I mean, a lot of the things actually we buy from Australia can be actually sourced from the United States. Many agricultural products, for example. So, I just don't understand this guy that, he's doing things to harm his own country. And for another country that is actually taking jobs and business opportunities away from him. I think we have almost like $50 billion of trade deficit with Australia. There's already a lot of voice within China saying that why are we keeping such a large trade deficit with this country, right? So I think with these actions, with the consequences of this, as we move forward, will be that you're going to see this trade deficit going to be closed, and it's nothing. No one to blame other than himself.
Thank you very much, Professor John Gong, Professor Chen Hong, and Mr. Daryl Guppy there. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Pan Deng in Beijing. Bye-bye.